Well, undoubtedly, some to many, if not all of us, have been on the receiving end of the phone call, the urgent, we need you to drop everything and come now phone call, come be with your loved one. Perhaps I've been on the pastor side of that phone call, drop everything and come and go and meet a church member or friend at a hospital or hospice. I've been on the police chaplain side of that phone call, and I guess on the Army chaplain side of that phone call, which usually means showing up and helping to deliver hard news. I haven't yet really been on the family member side of it, but we all know that imminent loss provokes this drop everything right now urgency. And I've wondered over the past weeks in thinking about this passage if Timothy felt that as he comes to verse 9 of chapter 4. Do your best to come to me soon. It's actually a command. It's not an invitation. Do your best. Hurry up. Do your best. Come to me soon. I looked up that in the first century, traveling from Ephesus, where Timothy was, to Rome, where Paul was, would have taken about a month, 3 to 4 weeks, in the summer on a boat. If you could get the wind from the right direction, it could take 2 weeks. But normal circumstances, it's a month walk from Ephesus to Rome. So that explains the do your best to come before winter, get here fast. And I've thought about that. Paul expects Timothy that is going to read this passage aloud in church. He expects that the congregation is going to listen in. That's why he ends the letter with the Lord be with your spirit, grace be with you. The you being plural, it's the y'all. Grace be with y'all. So if the whole church is listening in and they hear this command for Timothy to get going, and if Onesiphorus hands Timothy a ham sandwich and he races to the closest seaport, he's weeks to a month away from being with Paul. I mean, he might not have final words with Paul, but he will have this letter. This letter might well be Paul's final words to Timothy, and his written appeal, Paul's to Timothy and to the churches, as just as urgent. And we've looked at it over the past months, and we've seen that God's promise of life found in Jesus makes it urgent that the church in each generation do whatever is necessary to make the gospel known, even if it requires suffering. That's what Paul holds out to Timothy and invites him into. And along the way, Paul has invited Timothy to remember his heritage. He's reminded Timothy of the family investment that his grandmother and his mother made in him. Paul has reminded Timothy of his God-given giftedness. He's reminded Timothy that Jesus will strengthen Timothy when Timothy is weak, and Timothy might stumble, but Jesus' character is reliable. That even if Timothy falters, Jesus is his security. He reminds Timothy that God's word, which Timothy must preach in season and out of season, will also equip him for every good work, and that he can trust that the king has a future for him, a crown of righteousness that awaits all who have loved the king's appearing. All of these things now Timothy has read, and Timothy has in his memory in probably the 8 minutes or so that it's taken him to come down to verse 9 of chapter 4. Let me ask you an imagination question. How do you imagine Timothy's kind of, maybe we would say headspace, kind of emotional posture as he reads these last words? Timothy is not an untested rookie. He's not a novice pastor. 15 years have passed since he joined Paul's team in his hometown of Lystra, so he's been at it for a decade and a half. He joined the ministry team right after a big fight between Paul and Barnabas. These Two New Testament legends had wrangled over the usefulness of a man named Mark in ministry. In Acts 15, verse 37, Barnabas wanted to take with them John, called Mark, but Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them. In other words, Paul thought Mark was a quitter and shouldn't be on the team. Timothy was with Paul when the gospel got to Philippi, so Timothy would have been there when Lydia became the first Christian convert on the European continent, so far as we know. Lydia there from Turkey on a business trip in Greece, doing her work, trading textiles. Timothy would have seen her come to faith. And later, when Paul was in jail writing to his friends in Philippi, Timothy was at his side. Timothy had seen Paul's suffering and endurance. Timothy had suffered and proven himself. He was a 15-year veteran. I imagine that he would have read this letter with anxious urgency. And then I wonder if he read it with some degree of weariness. Some degree of kind of feeling the weight that was coming towards him as Paul was exiting the scene, and wondering, Timothy, if he had it in him to reboot and to recharge and to keep going. I wonder. Let's make it personal. Many of you have been Christians for more than a moment, and you might be able to feel this. You might remember kind of the sweet and good and right initial enthusiasm of faith, spiritual eyes opened to new realities. Does that ring a bell? Strike a memory? Sometimes, this is just a personal Dave theory. Sometimes I think that God grants for young believers to have these awesome experiences at the beginning of our Christian walks to kind of propel us forward, because there does come a moment when faith is not like the first lap of the race. It's like the middle miles of a marathon, and becomes more of a grind. Rooting out sin is hard. Sharing the gospel is hard. Relationships are hard. And one of the hardnesses of the church living in the last days, which is where the church always lives in the time kind of between Jesus' ascent into heaven and his still future return, one of the hardnesses of living in the last days is living with last days people. It gets wearying. I won't read the whole list that Paul put at the beginning of chapter 3, but it's just wearying. Sin has a wearying effect. And we know it because we still struggle with it. In wondering how these last verses hang together, and how this is more than just an assorted collection of greetings and sentences that don't otherwise make sense, I've found there to be in here lessons about spiritual resilience, which Timothy needs to glean and own, and which we need to glean and own. Lessons about resilience are one of the gifts in Paul's last words to Timothy. More than just an assortment of greetings, taken as a whole, I think they teach us at least 3 lessons about spiritual resilience in the last days, 3 lessons for us. So here they are, and then we'll explore them ever so briefly or at length. I don't know. Time will tell. Spiritual resilience depends on a love that's anchored in another world. Spiritual resilience thrives in the community of care. Spiritual resilience depends on communion with the King. So if you are a brand new Christian, these are things that you need to know. If you are chronologically mid-aged Christian, these are things that you need to know. If you think in the last quarter or the last eighth of your final lap. You need to know these things. First, you need to know that spiritual resilience depends on a love anchored in another world. Verse 9 and 10, do your best to come to me soon. Here's why. For Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Demas was a well-known ministry partner of the Apostle Paul's. If you're new to the New Testament, it's okay to not recognize his name, but as you become more familiar with it, he shows up. Paul calls him a fellow worker at the end of his short letter to Philemon. Paul identifies him in Colossians chapter 4. He says, Luke, the beloved physician, greets you, as does Demas. Now, Paul wrote Colossians from prison, which means that Demas was with Paul in prison. We know that Paul was freed from that imprisonment. The earliest kind of first century Christian tradition anyway, from a non-biblical book called First Clement, is that Paul traveled on to Spain after that imprisonment, that he preached the gospel in Spain. I wonder, we don't know, but maybe Demas traveled with Paul to Spain. He was there presumably when Paul was sprung. But now, in this final imprisonment, Demas leaves Paul. Demas has deserted me. When Matthew, the gospel writer, wants to translate what Jesus' cry of dereliction on the cross means, as Jesus cries in Aramaic, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, Matthew translates it into, my God, why have you forsaken me? Same word. Demas has forsaken me. It seems that Crescens going to Galatia and Titus is going to Dalmatia were understandable, planned, and endorsed. I think this because Titus was a well-known leader in the church. He gets a letter just like Timothy gets a letter. And if Titus had forsaken Paul, then Paul would have noted it. It would have stung the way that Demas's departure stung. Demas has forsaken me. I'll bet many of us have experienced the deep pain of betrayal. It's the biggest risk of love, isn't it? I mean, grief is a risk of love. It's a big risk of love, but grieving the loss of someone who didn't betray you is a good thing. Betrayal hurts. I'm sorry if you've had that experience. Betrayal hurts in ministry too. I've felt it. The 19th century pastor Charles Spurgeon experienced it. He described it in this way: if ever bonds ought to be held inviolable, religious connection should be. That's what Paul is feeling. Here are two sobering lessons. Like Timothy, Demas was not a novice Christian. He was not a novice pastor. He wasn't new to the work. Calvin puts it this way: Demas could not have assisted Paul without many troubles and vexations. Attended by imminent risk of his life, he was exposed to many reproaches and must have submitted to many insults and been constrained to leave off the care of his own affairs. Demas, Dave's paraphrase, was invested. Calvin continues, therefore, being overcome by his dislike of the cross, he resolved to consult his own interests, end quote. Second sobering observation: there's no reason to assume that Demas abandoned Jesus. There's no reason to assume that Demas adopted a gross heresy, because people who did adopt gross heresies in 2 Timothy were identified by name, and Demas isn't one of them. There's no reason to believe that Demas had joined in some kind of gross immorality or otherwise disqualified himself from ministry. All we know that Demas did is that he left. Demas left Rome and went to Thessalonica, and maybe he even thought he'd pick up the ministry there. So what is the nature of his desertion? The nature of his desertion, so far as we can tell, is he simply left where he was supposed to stay. He simply left where he was supposed to stay because his heart was anchored somewhere else. Demas didn't flinch at the first or the second big challenge. Why did he leave? Maybe he had just had enough. Maybe he was just thinking, I am just not sure I can do another imprisonment with Paul. I've already done one. I mean, Crescens gets to leave. Titus gets to leave. Maybe I'll leave. All Paul says is that Demas's heart was set on this present world. World doesn't mean planet. It's the word eon, and it describes not so much the celestial ball that we sit on, but it describes the age. It describes the way things are now. It describes this reality, that there came a moment in Demas's discipleship where the true affection of his heart was revealed, and what his heart really loved was this, the way things are, that he couldn't let go of. It's horribly convicting. Hearts in love with the values of this eon won't be resilient in the last days. This is challenging. It's challenging to me. Maybe it's challenging to you. Demas's example, I think, is not just a news note for Timothy. By the way, Demas is out. It's instructive for Timothy, because Paul needs Timothy to do what Demas didn't do. He needs Timothy to not desert. He needs Timothy to not check out. So what is the antidote? Demas's example means that we need hearts that are deeply in love, not with this eon, but with the coming eon. Not with this age, but with the age to come. So how do we do that? How do you cultivate love for an age that you haven't experienced with, especially when everything around you is so attractive and charming? Well, is it not simply that we start by setting our hearts deeply on the king of that age? That we anchor our affection in him? That we anchor our affection on the king who will reign not just for a moment when he parades into Jerusalem, and not just for a week when people think he might be the guy according to their terms, but to the king who comes and will reign forever. I mean, kings and presidents and nations and opportunities of this world and the agendas of nations will all pass away. And this is Demas's losing bet. That living safely in Thessalonica is more desirably than living faithfully in Rome. Because, as the church in Thessalonica knew, because Paul wrote to them, this day is coming. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven, with a cry of command, and the voice of an archangel, and with the sound of a trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will always be with the Lord. And that is when, if not before, you will know where you have had the affection of your heart anchored. When the King returns, what you want is for your affection to be anchored in Him. Because that's the eon that will last forever. So resilience is cultivated as we continue to cultivate our love for that King, and as we lessen our love for this eon. And when this eon calls out to us and says, this is all there is, we say, no, this is not all there is. Well, how are you going to do that? It's hard. You're going to need people around you to help you, which is, I think, the next lesson that Paul has for us here, that resilience depends on a community of care. It's challenging. This eon will always tug at us. It will always tug at us in little ways and in big ways, and there will be moments when our hearts are vulnerable. There are moments when my heart is vulnerable to the allure of this age. I don't know how the age allures you, but the thing that allures me is my pastoral escape fantasy. That there's an easier way. That there's a less painful way to get through a week. How does this eon allure you? Well, Paul points us to a common resource for resiliency. And this is apt for all of us, but if you're a younger Christian, this is critical for you to understand. Look at verses 11 to 13. Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for ministry. Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, also the books, and above all, the parchments. It's touchingly practical that Paul wants his cloak. As a matter of fact, I got a chuckle out of reading a commentary where the expert at great length noted that what Paul wants is what the Latins called as painula, which is, quote, an outer garment of heavy material, circular in shape with a hole in the middle for the head, end quote. I laughed. That's a poncho. Theologians need to get out more. But they're too busy writing about books, which is what Paul wants. He wants his books. So really what I want to talk to you is about ministerial book allowances. He said, bring the books, which are scrolls made of papyrus, and above all the parchments. And we can guess at what they are. Nobody knows. There's theories. Maybe it's books. Maybe it's his copy of the Old Testament. Maybe it's other stuff that he was working on. Maybe he had some copies of some of the New Testament books that were emerging. We don't know. The point is that Paul hasn't given up on learning. But beyond the books and the parchments and his poncho, what does Paul really want? He wants his friends. Isn't that what he wants? Luke alone is with me, Dr. Luke, gospel writer, missionary companion. And he wants Mark. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he's very useful to me for ministry. What a change over the previous 15 years, where it was Mark's debated usefulness that prompted the big fight with Barnabas. And just as an aside, what an encouragement in ministry. Think about people that you invest in. Think about if you're like a small group leader or a journey group leader and you're investing in people. And, there's people maybe you're like, man, I love them, but they're slow. They don't seem very useful for ministry. What an encouragement that Mark grows up and that Christians grow up. What an encouragement to ministry types who know that the seeds of Demas live in all of us. There are Demases who desert, but there are Marks who mature. Ministry partners who grow and become irreplaceable members of the community. I think about campus ministry staff investing in a generation of Marks. Keep going. Don't give up. Luke, Mark, and Timothy. Tychicus is going to Ephesus. I think he's going to Ephesus because that's where Timothy's at. I think Paul is saying to Timothy, I'm sending your replacement. I'm going to send Tychicus to free you up so that you can come here. That's just an assumption. But what isn't an assumption is Paul wants community around him. You don't need me to tell you that we live in a highly fragmented society. You experience it every day. How's it working? Do you love it? Do you love the loneliness? You don't love the loneliness. Isolationism, running from God and from each other, it's a byproduct of humanity's fall into sin. It's not incidental to Good Friday and to Jesus' experience on the cross. That the person who experienced the greatest community ever as a member of the Trinity experienced the greatest isolation ever on the cross. So that experiencing isolation on our behalf, he could bring us into community with the Father, but also with each other. When we talk about the importance of community at NPC, well, we're not just trying to replicate a sociology. We're trying to live out a theology. That you need a community around you. And I need a community around me, because if Paul needs a community of care around him, you do too. So when we talk about groups at NPC, when we encourage you to get into a group, we're doing that because we know that we need people in our lives who can love us. When our hearts start to get pulled by this age, and we start to feel a little Demasy, we need places where practical care can happen. Everybody at some time needs them to bring a cloak. I mean, metaphorically. Don't bring me a cloak. Or a poncho. I've got one. You need a community of care to keep pointing you back to Jesus. And I mean, I've been doing the job enough that I just know that Lone Ranger Christians don't thrive. Not necessarily that we'll lose the faith, right? That's the Spirit's work. But thriving requires community. Thirdly, resilience and communion with the King. Paul identifies two kinds of disappointing people to Timothy. First, he warns Timothy about Alexander. Alexander the coppersmith did me great harm. There are a couple of Alexanders in the New Testament. I imagine that it was a popular name because of Alexander the Great. But, there could be more than one guy named Alexander. Verse 20 of 1 Timothy 1, Paul talks about the excommunication of an Alexander. And then it might be the same Alexander who stood up at a riot in Ephesus, stirred by Paul's anti-idol ministry. Acts 19, we read, some of the crowd prompted Alexander, whom the Jews had put forward, and Alexander, motioning with his hand, wanted to make a defense to the crowd, but when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours they all cried out with one voice, "Great is Artemis of Ephesus." And here we have the right. We don't know if this is the same Alexander or what he hoped to say. Maybe it's an entirely different Alexander. There is a compelling thought that archaeologists know that there was a guild of coppersmiths in the city of Troas where the cloak was, so that when Paul says to Timothy, "Go get my poncho, and by the way, when you're there, watch out for Alexander the coppersmith," we don't know. All we know is that an Alexander did great harm to Paul, and that Paul wants Timothy to avoid him. The first kind of disappointing person, the gospel opponent. But there is a second kind of disappointing person that Paul identifies to Timothy: the disappointing Christian. And he does this in order to articulate grace towards them. Grace which I presume Paul wants Timothy to extend to them too. Paul's first defense in Rome, I think for the lawyers among us, would have been something like his arraignment. There were Christians in Rome. We know because Paul had written a book to them that we call Romans. And in this book called Romans, Paul includes an encouragement about sacrificing for other Christians' good because Christ sacrificed himself for us. In Romans 15, we who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, to build him up. For Christ did not please himself, but as it was written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me. In other words, in Romans, to the Roman Christians, hey, at some point it's going to become risky and dangerous to be associated with Jesus. And when it becomes risky and dangerous to be associated with Jesus, go for it. It's okay, because Jesus let reproach fall upon him. Now, it would have been great encouragement for some Roman Christians to go down to Paul's arraignment and stand with him if they'd remembered the letter that he wrote to them. But they didn't. As it happened, at my first defense, no one came to stand by me, but all deserted me. But here's the thing. It would be the rare Christian who hasn't let another Christian down. So how does Paul pray for them? May it not be charged against them. Now, who would Paul have learned this patience from? Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And where might Paul have experienced this patience himself? Falling to his knees, Stephen cried out with a loud voice, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." And when he had said this, he fell asleep. And Saul approved of his execution. What a word from Paul to Timothy about the great potential for building up Christian community that exists simply when we don't charge our disappointments to each other. When we don't do this, what we are actually doing is loving each other. Because when Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 13, when he says, "Love does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful." Resentful is the same word as not holding sin against. Love like this, Holy Spirit produced love, is the outcome of communion with the Lord, which is what Paul describes in verse 17. "But the Lord stood by me and strengthened me, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed, and all the Gentiles might hear it. so I was rescued from the lion's mouth. When we remember the triumphal entry, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we remember Jesus being hailed as king. He was hailed by the people as God's king, only to be rejected as king a Friday later. And then the rejected king became the risen king. And as the risen king, he defends his people. He still defends his people. The Catechism puts it this way: he preserves as king, he preserves and supports them under all their temptations and suffering, restraining and overcoming all their enemies, and powerfully ordering all things for their own glory, for his own glory and their good. And isn't this what Paul experiences as he writes verse 18? The Lord will rescue me from every evil deed and bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. Paul doesn't mean that everything is going to work out okay right then at the trial. He doesn't know how the trial is going to work out. He thinks it's not going to work out well. For I'm already being poured out, he says. He's not saying that Jesus is the dispenser of easy answers to hard problems. As much as he is saying that Jesus is the present king who is in communion with his people when they go through the hard times. He's going to rescue Paul from every evil deed, including Paul's own execution. And he's going to bring Paul safely into his heavenly kingdom. He's going to bring him into the next age. The age that Demas did not have his heart set on, but that Paul did. And that Paul wants Timothy to have his heart set on. And that he wants us to have our heart set on. Because the king will protect and will defend each step of the way. So you need to have your heart anchored in that age. And you need a community of people around you to point you to that age. And you need to trust the communion that you have with the king as you go through the challenges of this age.